Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new League of Legends video. So there's somewhat of a new champion right now that is extremely dominant in the mid lane and top lane as well. And that champion, to no surprise right now, is Ryze. He's been demolishing high-low Korean solo queue, he's been rising in popularity insanely, and high-level players and pro players always pick him up, especially players like Faker who play in competitive play. For instance, very recently at MSI, whenever Faker would get Ryze, he would always absolutely dominate his opponents. And just in general, Ryze was an extremely popular pick at MSI as well. So I figured it's time to talk about Ryze, give you guys everything you need to know about this champion and how to play him, and more importantly, talk about the different types of combos you do with this passive. Because trust me, it's a lot more difficult than you may initially think. So you're probably seeing Ryze much more frequently in your games, whether it's solo queue or even normals. So hopefully this will give you a better understanding of the champion, especially if you want to go ahead and try him out. Again, it works perfectly well in top lane and mid lane. Though I honestly think it's a bit better mid lane just because the lane is shorter and Ryze obviously has no escapes. But just before we jump into the video guys, the question I'm going to be asking you is, McDonald's or Subway? Very tough question. And if you end up enjoying this video, then make sure to hit that like button to let me know. Alright, so as usual, let's first quickly talk about the positives and negatives, the strengths and weaknesses of Ryze. So in my honest opinion, I believe this guy is very strong right now, especially if you understand his mechanics and how to play him, when to go in, when not to go in. But on the flip side, if you don't really know what you're doing, you don't really know the combos with him, then you are gonna be relatively useless. Because again, if you use the combos correctly and you burst down a target, maybe in a 1v1 or in a team fight, then it's gonna feel satisfying. You're gonna do a lot of damage and you're gonna be a huge presence. But if you mess up the combo and you don't do it correctly, it'll completely mess up your full rotation of spells. The cooldowns on your abilities, obviously mixed with your passive, is gonna be all messed up, and your damage during that fight is gonna be going down significantly. On top of this, when the mid-season mage rework happened and the mana items got changed around, it was actually a pretty good buff for Ryze. The reason is quite simple. I mean, the new Tear of the Goddess gives him more mana refunded whenever he casts his abilities, and the new Rod of Ages with the Catalyst effect also gives him mana back whenever he takes damage, so well, it just works out perfectly. If you utilize the combo correctly to burst down a target, which I will talk about later on in the video, you can easily 100-0 a target. But the cherry on the cake with this burst is the fact that if you do it correctly, your target will not even be able to move. You can use your ultimate freely with your passive to wave clear to get the move speed, because you will have the ultimate up very quickly if you utilize the passive properly. He scales insanely well, and I mean, overall this guy is just very strong, and I highly recommend either understanding how to play against him or how to play him. The negatives is the fact that he will run out of mana extremely quickly before your first Tear of the Goddess, which is why teleport is essential. Falling behind with him is going to suck a lot because you have no escapes and your damage just won't really be there. And this one a lot of people are gonna not believe me on, but he does take a lot of practice. He's not an easy champion, and utilizing him properly at a higher elo, or at least players of your skill level if not higher, is not very easy. It will take a few games to understand his different combos and when to use which. But next, let's talk about some tips and tricks and the different types of combos that you need to know to play Ryze successfully. So first, just be really careful with how you use your mana before you get your Tear of the Goddess and Rod of Ages, because you will run out of mana very quickly up until you get it stacked up. And try to understand when you can be aggressive and when you cannot be aggressive with this champion, especially in the laning phase. But once we talk about the combos, you should get a better idea. Now, I'll show you this later, but you usually can choose between two keystones, both of which are quite good. Now, that's Storm Raider's Surge and Thunderlords. Thunderlords I only recommend taking if you think you can demolish your lane opponent and just go absolutely ham. Else, the safer pick is Storm Raider's Surge. When stacking up your passive while you're getting ready for the kill or just slowly getting ready to make something happen, you want to try to use your Q about 80% of the time. The reason is quite simple. It has the lowest cooldown, mana cost, and it's also the only ability other than your ultimate where you do not need to hit a target in order to get a stack of your passive. Plain and simple, it's just the easiest one to use. And the last thing is, do not be afraid to pop your ultimate combined with your passive whenever you're wave clearing, because again, your ultimate will be up in just a few seconds after that. But now that we have these general tips and tricks out of the way, let's next move into all of the different types of combos that are 100% essential to know. So we'll talk about the combos in order, and the first one we'll do is when you have 2 passive stacks of the 5. This is one of the better combos that you should definitely know how to do. So the idea here is when you have 2 stacks, obviously you want to add 5 to proc your passive. So the way you do that is you press R for the move speed, you move up to your target, you throw QW, proc your passive, and then you go QE, QW, QE. Now it sounds pretty confusing at first, so let's go through that one more time. But an easier way to think about this is you want to throw your Q in between every other spell. So let's take a look at this example one more time in slow motion. So I proc my ultimate, get 3 stacks, throw QW, procs my passive, and then you want to throw your Q, then your E, then your Q, then your W, then your Q, and then your E. If it still sounds confusing, I apologize, but that's honestly the easiest way to explain it. Next up, we have an example to use whenever you have 3 stacks of your passive. This is also a really strong one that you should definitely know how to do, and it also helps you get in range of your opponent. It's very similar to the previous one, you just don't throw a Q at the beginning. But the idea usually is to have your W as the final spell in the 5 spells you cast with your passive so that your Q and E are both off cooldown. But let's take a look at that example in slow motion. So you're at 3 stacks, you use your ultimate for the 4th, move up to your target with the extra move speed, start with your W, and then you go Q, E, Q, W, Q, E. And this will give you a full rotation of your spells. Alright, but what if you don't want to use your ultimate, or what if your ultimate's on cooldown and you're at 3 stacks? What do? Well, here's the second example, add 3 stacks of your passive without using your ultimate. The idea behind this is still very similar, but to get a better understanding, let's take another look in slow motion. So here you start with Q, then your W, procs your passive, Q, E, Q, W, Q, E. Notice how there's a Q between every other spell. This is something really important to remember to make this overall seem a little bit easier. And finally, we'll talk about 2 examples that you can do with 4 stacks, the first of which being the slightly worse version, but it's really good to use if you just have to use your ultimate because you need to gap close. The only issue with this one is that you don't get that final W spell to reduce your Q and E once your passive finishes for some extra damage. But for this, you proc your passive with your ultimate, get the move speed, get in range of your target, start with your W, Q, E, Q, and then W. You still get 2 snares off, so it's pretty useful in that sense, but there's a better version. Now this one you do not need your ultimates, but you also do it at 4 stacks. You start with W to proc the passive, and then you do the full rotation that you should now be familiar with, being the Q, E, Q, W, Q, E. But just in case, here it is in slow motion. W to proc passive, Q, E, Q, W, Q, E. This one has a lot more damage than the previous example, but you don't utilize your ultimates, so if you need to gap close, then you might want to use the previous example. Or just simply do not get to 4 stacks and instead get to 3 or 2. Alright, so that was a lot to take in, but I hope you guys understood it, and I hope I explained it decently well. Next, let's quickly touch on what abilities to level and summoner spells to take. If there is a level 1 fight happening, then you want to take your W. If there isn't, then you want to take Q if you took Storm Raider Surge, or you can take E if you took Thunderlords, because one auto attack plus Thunderlords on your target will proc its effect. Other than that though, you want to max your Q first, followed by your W, and then your E. And when it comes to summoner spells, no matter if you're playing top lane or mid lane, you want to go Flash Teleport. The teleport is absolutely vital. And the reason it's vital is because you want to be able to back and get your Tear of the Goddess followed by a Ruby Crystal as soon as possible to get it stacking up. And your first few levels are going to be quite poor, so you're going to need that extra help. Let's go into the build next and first start off with the runes and the masteries. So there's 2 examples for the masteries. You can either go 12, 18, 0, obviously taking either Thunderlords or Storm Raiders, or the other example for the mastery page is going 0, 18, 12. This one is a lot more utility focused, but honestly of the 2, I personally prefer the 0, 18, 12 page. Now on to the runes. For your reds, you want magic penetration. For yellows, usually you want HP. Your blues can usually be magic resistance, but Faker actually runs magic penetration blues, which unless you are a very skilled Ryze player, I do not recommend. And your quints can either be flat AP or move speed. But since usually Storm Raider Surge can do its job on top of your ultimate, you can get away with the AP instead. But let's talk about what actual items you want to get. You can either start off with the Mana Crystal and 3 potions or the Dorans and 2 potions. Most people I see do go for the Mana Crystal because it helps you get that tier of the goddess, which is absolutely vital to get as soon as possible, a lot sooner. Either way though, you want to back and get your tier of the goddess as soon as possible using your first TP, while also starting to work towards the Rod of Ages. So it'll look something like at the very bottom, tier of the goddess into Catalyst, Rod of Ages, your boots of choice, finish off the Archangel staff, and then you go into the other options. If there's a lot of magic damage on the enemy team, Abyssal Scepter is fantastic. Now your Void Staff is almost always going to be a recommended item, and you almost always want to have it somewhere in your inventory, whether it's sooner or later. But Rabadon, Zhonya's, or Abyssal Scepter are usually the ones that I recommend you look at. And just before we end off this video, I'll be talking about my final rating like I usually do. So I decided to give him a very impressive 8.5 out of 10 because I truly believe Ryze is actually quite overpowered. Now, I don't really think I'm a very good Ryze player, so I'm not honestly the best on him, but I've seen some insane Ryze players do some absolutely ridiculous things. And if you truly understand this guy and know how to utilize his combos, when and how and all that stuff, I promise you, you will absolutely melt face. Definitely a champion I recommend picking up if you play mid lane or top lane and you want to either just play the meta champions or pick up something new. But either way guys, that is about it for this video. This one was quite in depth, so if you did enjoy, definitely let me know by hitting that like button. If you have any questions about Ryze or the combos that you do on him, you can definitely leave them in the comments section below. But I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Make sure to share this with your friends, subscribe if you haven't, and check out my other videos as well. And here are my favorite comments from the previous videos. Question: what is your favorite mid lane champion? But thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next video. Peace.